Guten Tag, meine Damen und Herren, und herzlich willkommen zurück. Wir haben jetzt die 26. Lektion erreicht. Ich möchte diese Lektion mit 3 deutschsprachigen Filmen beginnen. Und diese sind Filme, die ich sehr sehenswert finde. Honestly, I'd even venture to say that these 3 movies rank among my favorite German language films of all time. Und welche sind diese 3 Filme? Der erste Film heißt Das Boot. Der zweite Film heißt Lola rennt. Und der dritte Film heißt Das Leben der anderen. Jawohl, das sind meine Lieblingsfilme in deutscher Sprache. Sie sind spannend, rührend und sehr interessant. Now, obviously we can't watch them here in their entirety, but I can tell you that all 3 are readily available on streaming media services for rent or for purchase. And by the way, if you're one of those learners who likes to use foreign language movies and TV shows as a way to hone your listening comprehension skills or to build your vocabulary, well, these streaming media services offer a particularly useful feature: subtitles in English and German. In fact, you can watch all 3 of the films we'll learn about today mit englischen oder mit deutschen Untertiteln. Und diese Methode kann sehr wirksam sein. By the way, I actually have 2 reasons for kicking off our lesson today with this trio of films. First, as I've already mentioned, these movies are just plain awesome. Sie sind spannend, rührend und sehr interessant. And second, we're going to use these films as der Ausgangspunkt for our grammar topics, namely der Komparativ, der Superlativ und Adjektivendungen. So let's go back to my trio of sehenswerte Filme. Here we have some information about these films. We see die Spieldauer, das Erscheinungsjahr, die Produktionskosten und die Zuschauerzahlen in deutschen Kinos. Now then, using this information, how would you answer the following question? Are you ready? Here goes. Welcher Film ist am längsten und welcher ist am kürzesten? Richtig. You'd say, Das Boot ist am längsten und Lola rennt ist am kürzesten. Now what about this question? Welcher Film ist am ältesten und welcher am neuesten? Genau, the answer is, Das Boot ist am ältesten und das Leben der anderen ist am neuesten. Notice that these are all questions that ask you to compare the films. Here's another such question. Welcher Film hat am meisten und welcher hat am wenigsten gekostet? The answer is, Das Boot hat am meisten gekostet. As for the second part of the question, welcher hat am wenigsten gekostet? This is actually a trick question because Lola rennt and Das Leben der anderen cost the same amount. In this case, when we compare 2 things that are in some manner or form equal, well, we would say this. Lola rennt hat so viel wie Das Leben der anderen gekostet. We'll come back to this point in just a bit. But first, let's answer one final question about these 3 great films. Bei welchem Film waren die Zuschauerzahlen am größten und bei welchem waren sie am geringsten? As we can see from the info sheet, the answer to this question would be, bei dem Film Das Boot waren die Zuschauerzahlen am größten und bei dem Film Das Leben der anderen waren die Zuschauerzahlen am geringsten. Meine Damen und Herren, these adjectival constructions are called the superlative. The superlative in German, just like the superlative in English, describes a noun or action as the most, as in the biggest, the most expensive, the longest, and so on. You use the superlative when you're comparing 3 or more things. In this case, we're comparing 3 German language films. Now, the superlative is formed by, first, putting an am before the adjective and adding an stn suffix to the adjective. Schön am schönsten, lecker am leckersten. Or, if the adjective ends in a t, d, or z, the superlative suffix is estn. Intelligent am intelligentesten. Mild am mildesten. Stolz am stolzesten. And third, if the adjective has an a, an o, or a u as its stressed vowel, then it often takes an umlaut. Alt am ältesten. Groß am größten. Jung am jüngsten. Gesund am gesündesten. Be sure to check out the course workbook for a longer list of adjectives in their superlative form. I'd also like to point out that this am plus stn or estn form of the superlative occurs when the adjective comes after the noun it's describing. Now, this type of adjective is what we call an adjective of the predicate. For example, in English we can say either, "That's an interesting film," or "That film is interesting." Now, the latter sentence has what we call an adjective of the predicate. That is, the adjective comes after the noun. In German, this sentence would be, "Der Film ist interessant." In the first sentence, though, the adjective interesting comes before the noun that it's describing. This is what we call an attributive adjective. And in German, this sentence would now be, "Das ist ein interessanter Film." Notice that when interessant is used as an attributive adjective, it actually takes an ending. In this sentence, it's an ER, ein interessanter Film. And in fact, this ER is one of several Adjektivendungen. And in a few minutes, we'll see that German grammar actually requires all attributive adjectives to have a particular ending. Ist das nicht schön? Aber bitte, keine Panik. As usual, I shall show you some insider tricks for learning these adjective endings. For now, our main takeaway about adjectives is twofold. On the one hand, when you describe a noun with an attributive adjective in German, that adjective takes a grammatical ending that matches the gender, case, and number of the noun. For example, das ist ein interessanter Film. But on the other hand, when you describe a noun with a predicate adjective, that adjective does not take a grammatical ending. For example, der Film ist interessant. Alles klar? Gut. This now brings us back to our superlative examples, because when we express predicate adjectives in the superlative form, we need only one kind of ending on the adjective, the stn or the estn. For example, we might say the following about the 3 German films that I've recommended. Das Leben der anderen und Das Boot sind beide interessant, aber ich finde Lola Rent am interessantesten. Or check out this super cute Giraffenfamilie. Es gibt Mama Giraffe, Papa Giraffe und Baby Giraffe. And we would describe this Giraffenfamilie as follows. Die Papa Giraffe ist am größten. Or we might say, die Baby Giraffe ist am kleinsten. Alles klar? In fact, you know what? Let's stay with our super cute giraffe family and let's see how the comparative works in German. Again, we're going to stick with predicate adjectives for now. So, imagine that I asked you the following about these cute giraffes. Welche Giraffe ist größer? Das Baby oder die Mutter? Well, the correct answer would be, die Mutter ist größer als das Baby. Or if I asked you, welche Giraffe ist kleiner? Der Vater oder die Mutter? Now the correct response would be, die Mutter ist ein bisschen kleiner als der Vater. First of all, note that in German, the comparative works similarly to the comparative in English. Namely, you add an ER to the adjective or adverb. So for example, schnell becomes schneller, langsam, langsamer, interessant, interessanter, and so weiter und so fort. Second, note that in German you don't say mehr interessant as you would in English, more interesting. In this respect, German happens to be more regular than English. German doesn't use the word mehr with any adjectives to build the comparative. It only uses the comparative suffix er. However, yes, there's a however, while German is largely regular in its comparative and superlative constructions, there are some irregular forms, aber nicht zu viele. For example, check out these berühmte Berge. Mit 5.895 Meter ist der Kilimanjaro hoch, aber mit 8.611 Meter ist der K2 höher. Aber der Mount Everest ist am höchsten mit 8.848 Meter. As we can see, the adjective hoch is one of the aforementioned adjectives that takes an irregular form in the comparative and or superlative. It goes hoch, höher, am höchsten. Some other common irregular adjectives include gut, besser, am besten, nah, näher, am nächsten, gern, lieber, am liebsten, viel, mehr, am meisten und bald, eher, am ehesten. By the way, you'll notice that in German we use the conjunction als to express the concept of than when we're comparing two things. For instance, if we were to compare me with, say, Prince William, we could say, Prinz William ist jünger als Herr Frem. And if we compared Prince William to his brother, well, we could say, Prinz William ist älter als sein Bruder. And by the way, as you can see from this picture, ich esse gern Austern. But moving on, here's one more important thing to keep in mind when comparing things in German. If you're expressing that two or more things are equal in some way, well, then you use the construction so, wie. For instance, we might say about the royal duchesses Kate and Meghan, Herzogin Kate ist so elegant wie Herzogin Meghan. Or, Herzogin Meghan ist so schön wie Herzogin Kate. Alles klar? And that, meine Damen und Herren, is how the comparative and superlative works for predicate adjectives. It's not too difficult, right? Which brings us to our next topic, which you might say is ein bisschen schwieriger als der Komparativ und der Superlativ. Earlier in this lesson, when we discussed the two main types of adjectives, you remember, the attributive adjectives and the adjectives of the predicate? Well, you might recall that I asked you to file away the following important point. Attributive adjectives take a grammatical ending that matches the gender, case, and number of the noun that it modifies. In other words, whenever we describe someone or something in German with an adjective that comes before the person, thing, or the idea that we're describing, the adjective needs an ending. And not just any ending thrown in at random. Just like the grammatical endings that we've learned for ein words and der words, are you ready? The ending on an attributive adjective expresses the number, gender, and case of the noun that it's modifying. For example, do you recall how we concluded the previous lesson? I asked you to consider the ending that the adjective chaotisch takes when Mia uses it when Ralph asks the following about their daughter's room. Remember, he asks her, hat sie wieder ein chaotisches Zimmer? Now, before we go over the ending on the adjective chaotisch, let's take a moment and analyze the sentence itself. First, what is the subject? Richtig. It's the third person, singular, feminine pronoun, sie. It's the person that's having a chaotic room. Second, what is the subject's direct object? Genau. The noun Zimmer is the direct object and, therefore, in the accusative. It's the thing that the subject is having. Gut. And now that we've established this noun's grammatical case, here's the next question. What is its number and gender? Jawohl. Zimmer is a singular neuter noun, das Zimmer. And in fact, all of this grammatical information, the number, the gender, and the case of the noun Zimmer, is expressed both through the indefinite article ein and through the es ending on the adjective chaotisch. And for the biggest question of all, are you ready? Why does Mia then put this es on the adjective? Well, allow me, your humble yet knowledgeable guide, to explain. The first thing you need to know is that, basically, German has three types, well, we'll call them sets, of adjective endings. Set 1 adjective endings are for adjectives that are preceded by an ein word, as in Mia's question, hat sie wieder ein chaotisches Zimmer? As you can see, the ein comes before the adjective chaotisch. Set 2 endings are for adjectives preceded by a der word. And finally, set 3 adjective endings are for adjectives that have neither an ein word nor a der word before them. In other words, set 3 adjective endings are for what we call unpreceded adjectives. Also dann, meine Damen und Herren, shall we? Yes, we shall. Schön. Let's start with set 1 endings. Are you ready? If you construct a noun phrase that has an ein word followed by an attributive adjective and a noun, for example, the noun phrase ein spannender Film, you need to place the following endings onto your adjective. When describing a nominative subject, the ending is er for masculine nouns, e for feminine nouns, es for neuter nouns, and en for plural nouns. For example, wo ist dein neuer Wagen? Eure alte Katze liegt unter dem Bett. Das ist unser kleines Haus. Das sind keine freundlichen Leute. When the adjective is modifying a direct object, that is, a noun in the accusative case, the ending is en for masculine nouns, e for feminine nouns, es for neuter nouns, and en for plural nouns. For example, wo hast du deinen neuen Wagen gekauft? Ich kann eure alte Katze nicht finden. Wir lieben unser kleines Haus. Es gibt keine freundlichen Leute auf der Party. And finally, when the adjective is modifying an indirect object, in other words, when the adjective is describing a noun in the dative case, well, the endings are actually all the same, whether masculine, feminine, neuter, or plural. And that ending is en. For example, habe ich dir von meinem neuen Wagen erzählt? Ich spiele gern mit eurer alten Katze. Wir wohnen in einem kleinen Haus. Haben Sie schon mit Ihren neuen Kollegen gesprochen? Nun, I realize that this might be a lot to memorize, so be patient with yourself and don't forget our course motto, which I probably don't have to remind you of anymore, do I? Übung macht den Meister. Anyways, on a personal note, I can still remember, pretty darn clearly in fact, the time that I spent staring at the table of adjective endings we just saw. Not to mention the other tables we're going to see in a moment. And even after I did manage to memorize all those tables, it took a lot of practice before I finally felt comfortable using them in my spoken German. But one piece of advice I can give is this: look for patterns. For instance, check out the table for set 1 endings again. Are you ready? Notice that if the noun is dative or plural, the ending is an en. Well, this alone counts for half of the endings in the whole table. Anyway, this is what I mean by looking for patterns. Also dann, meine Damen und Herren, now that we've gotten our feet wet, so to speak, let us now move on to set 2 adjective endings. Remember that these are adjectives preceded by a der word. And to help us out with these two adjective endings are none other than Herr und Frau Gruber. They're going to model a captivating dialogue for us about movies. And in so doing, they're going to show us how set two adjective endings work in real-world conversation. Alles klar? Prima. Also dann, Herr und Frau Gruber, bitteschön.
Sag mal, wie heißt denn wieder dieser neue Film?
Er heißt In die blaue Tiefe hinein.
In die blaue Tiefe hinein. Naja, das klingt spannend.
Das ist ein Liebesfilm.
Ach, schon wieder ein Liebesfilm?
Was hast du gegen Liebesfilme?
Die letzten 3 Filme, die wir im Kino gesehen haben, waren Liebesfilme.
Das ist nicht wahr.
Doch, wir haben jeden romantischen Film in der ganzen Stadt gesehen.
Dieser Film soll sehr gut sein.
Und welche Schauspieler gibt es in diesem romantischen Film?
Die bekanntesten Schauspieler in ganz Deutschland.
Jetzt verarschst du mich.
Psst, der Film fängt an.
Vielen Dank, Herr und Frau Gruber. Now, regardless of our own opinions of Liebesfilme with titles like In die blaue Tiefe hinein, the Gruber's dialogue offers several authentic examples of the endings that we need to put on adjectives that are preceded by a der word. Here, meine Damen und Herren, is another handy table that shows us these endings. Also dann, let's go through them, shall we? If the adjective is preceded by a der word, and that adjective is describing a singular nominative subject, the ending is the same for all 3 genders. It's I. For plurals, though, the adjective ending takes in. For example, wo ist der neue Wagen? Diese alte Katze liegt gern unter dem Bett. Welches kleine Haus gehört dir? Die leckeren Kekse sind teuer. Moving on to nouns in the accusative case, the adjective takes an en with masculine nouns, an e with feminine and neuter nouns, and an en with plural nouns. For example, wo hast du diesen neuen Wagen gekauft? Ich liebe diese alte Katze. Ich suche das kleine Haus an der Ecke. Welche leckeren Kekse isst du am liebsten? Finally, when an adjective preceded by a der word is describing a dative noun, the adjective takes the same ending for all 3 genders and the plural, an en. For example, ich fahre gern schnell mit diesem neuen Sportwagen. Ich möchte dieser alten Katze Thunfisch geben. In jedem kleinen Haus kann man auch große Wanzen finden. Wir sollen den netten Menschen helfen. Großartig. So, in a nutshell, set 2 adjective endings comprise only 2 options, either an e or an en. So I guess that makes the chances of getting them right 50-50. Oder auf Deutsch 50-50. Schön. Meine Damen und Herren, so far we've covered 2 of the 3 sets of adjective endings. And do you recall what set 3 adjective endings are? Richtig. These are adjectives not preceded by an ein or a der word. In other words, they're unpreceded attributive adjectives. By the way, we have unpreceded adjectives in English too, although obviously we don't put any endings on them. For example, in a sentence like, serious professors seldom wear silly ties, the adjectives here, serious and silly, are unpreceded. In German, this sentence would go, ernste Professoren tragen selten alberne Krawatten. Or imagine that we're enjoying a nice dinner with friends and we make a toast. We raise our glass and we say, here's to good food, good wine, and wonderful company. All these adjectives are unpreceded, and in German our toast would go, auf gutes Essen, guten Wein und großartige Gesellschaft. As you know, in German, each of these nouns has a different grammatical gender. Wein is masculine, Essen is neuter, and Gesellschaft is feminine. What's more, they're all accusative because of the preposition auf. And by the way, don't worry right now why the preposition auf makes them accusative. Just remember that it does. Entschuldigung. So then, without further ado, here is our third and final table of beautiful adjective endings. For the nominative, the adjective takes an ER ending for masculine nouns, an E for feminine and plural nouns, and an ES for neuter nouns. For example, kalter Kaffee schmeckt nicht gut. Warme Pizza schmeckt besser als kalte Pizza. And that's true. Frisches Brot schmeckt besser als altes Brot. Also true. Intelligente Menschen lernen Deutsch. Also very true. Moving on to the next row, when an unpreceded adjective is describing an accusative direct object, the adjective takes an EN for masculine nouns, an E for both feminine and for plural nouns, and an ES for neuter nouns. For example, ich trinke nie kalten Kaffee. Freitags esse ich kalte Pizza. Jeden Morgen backen wir frisches Brot. And ich kenne intelligente Leute, die Deutsch sprechen. And finally, for the dative case, the adjective gets an EM with masculine and neuter nouns, an ER with feminine nouns, and an EN with plural nouns. For example, dieses Kleid ist aus teurem Stoff. Welcher Wein ist gut mit kalter Pizza? Bei kaltem Wetter bleibe ich zu Hause. And ich spreche gern mit intelligenten Leuten. And by the way, I speak happily with everyone, not just intelligent people. By the way, these adjective endings should remind us of the endings that we've already learned for another type of word in German. Take a look. Dieser Mann heißt Ralf. Ich liebe diese Katze. Ich schenke diesem Kind eine Jacke. Meine Damen und Herren, are you ready for this? The der word endings that we've already learned are in fact the same endings that we put on unpreceded adjectives. Here again is the table for der word endings. And here is that table for set 3 adjective endings. The only thing that changes is the title of the table. Otherwise, everything is the same. Cool, huh? Be sure to file this tip away in your memory. Unpreceded adjectives take the same endings as der words. Also dann, meine Damen und Herren, if you'll forgive all the alliterations in the subsequent sentence, this concludes our fantastic foray into the wondrous world of the comparative, superlative, and adjective endings in German. I do hope all the endings in tables haven't scared you off. It's just that, well, these endings are a central part of the German grammar puzzle. I mean, it's how the language works. And if and when you do really learn them, and if and when you get to the point where you can use them in your spoken German, well, let me assure you, native speakers will notice this. And they'll be very impressed, to the extent that you might even find yourself with a spendierter Drink in your hand, as I can attest to from experience. Also dann, here, one last time, is a quick reference punch list of what we've learned about adjective endings in this lesson. 1. As an adjective of the predicate, adjectives can have no ending. Mein Hund ist nett. 2. As an attributive adjective, they take a grammatical ending according to the number, gender, and case of the noun they're describing. Ich habe einen netten Hund. 3. There are 3 sets of endings for attributive adjectives, depending on whether they're preceded by an ein word, preceded by a der word, or unpreceded. 4. They can have a comparative ending. Mein Hund ist netter als dein Hund. And 5. They can have a superlative ending, as in, mein Hund ist am kleinsten. Ausgezeichnet. Also dann, meine Damen und Herren, before we say auf Wiedersehen und bis gleich, I would like to leave you with a German language challenge. And it's this. It's going to be your first joke in the German language. By the way, the German word for joke is der Witz. And this Witz in particular is what we call ein Wortspiel. That is a play on words. Also dann, are you ready? Here is your first Witz auf Deutsch. Was macht man in der Wüste, wenn man eine große Schlange sieht? Well, tune into our next lesson, die 27. Lektion, for the answer/punchline. Auf Wiedersehen und bis gleich.